So I'll go ahead and get started and kind of share my thoughts on how Dr. King viewed the issue of guns and gun violence. And I'm going to use a lot of his own words. I'm not going to try to speak for him. I pulled a number of quotes kind of throughout his life where he spoke to the topic that I think really get to the point. There are really four touchstones in King's life that I think shed a lot of light on how he viewed the issue of gun violence and how he viewed the issue, let's say, of taking up arms to defend oneself or to engage in violent acts, whether justified or not. One of the most interesting ones was when Dr. King was living in Montgomery when he was a younger man. And there was actually a time in his life when Dr. King applied for a permit to carry a firearm in his car. You know, he was in an early point in his career, but he was very publicly vocal about civil rights, and he was obviously, you know, even as a young man, receiving a lot of death threats. And he did apply with Montgomery police for a permit to carry a gun in his car. He was denied. They refused to give him that permit, and they rejected his application. Shortly thereafter, in January of 1956, he was speaking at a mass meeting at a church, and someone exploded a bomb on the porch of his house where he lived. And he came home at that time, and you know, he heard about it at church. Someone rushed over, told him, and he came back to his house, and you know, almost immediately a crowd of his supporters had gathered in front of his home. And many of them were armed. You know, some of them had knives, guns, and were preparing potentially for violence in response. And he told them, and I quote, as a reporter who was there quoted him, "Don't get panicky, don't do anything panicky, don't get your weapons. If you have weapons, take them home. He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword." Remember, that is what Jesus said. We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies. I want you to love our enemies. Be good to them. This is what we must live by. We must meet hate with love. That's what he told them in a moment very shortly after a bomb had blown up on his house, possibly by someone trying to kill him and his family. And then later, he got into greater detail about his desire to own firearms and how this event changed him. At this time, he had been denied the permit to carry that firearm in his car, but he did own a gun in his home for self-defense, and at that point, his bodyguards were armed with guns to defend him. And he had a change of heart after the bombing. He had, you know, his house was bombed. He had some other close friends that had attempted attacks of this nature. And he wrote the following. He said, "After the bombings, many of the officers of my church and other trusted friends urged me to hire a bodyguard and armed watchmen for my house. When my father came to town, he concurred with both of these suggestions. I tried to tell them that I had no fears now and consequently needed no weapons for protection. This they would not hear. They insisted that I protect the house and family, even if I didn't want to protect myself. In order to satisfy the wishes of those close friends and associates, I decided to consider the question of an armed guard. I went down to the sheriff's office and applied for a license to carry a gun in the car, but this was refused. Meanwhile, I reconsidered, how could I serve as one of the leaders of a nonviolent movement at the same time use weapons of violence for my personal protection? Coretta, his wife, and I talked the matter over for several days and finally agreed that arms were no solution. We decided then to get rid of the one weapon we owned. We tried to satisfy our friends by having floodlights mounted around the house and hiring unarmed watchmen around the clock. I also promised that I would not travel around the city alone." And then King said this, which is very interesting. He said, "I was much more afraid in Montgomery when I had a gun in my house. When I decided that I couldn't keep a gun, I came face to face with the question of death, and I dealt with it. From that point on, I no longer needed a gun, nor have I been afraid. Had we become distracted by the question of my safety, we would have lost the moral offensive and sunk to the level of our oppressors." So these are some very interesting thoughts, right? I mean, here's a guy whose house has just been bombed. I don't know if there's any American in human history who's ever been threatened more than Dr. King, and in the moment, perhaps, of his greatest personal crisis, facing these enormous threats to his family, decides to disarm himself and his bodyguards and feels safer once he does so. And, you know, I don't know if that, probably part of that is the paranoia that one gets caught up when you carry a gun around constantly. but that's how he felt. He felt safer when he didn't have a gun. And then there's that remarkable section at the end where he talks about, if he had reached a point where he was carrying a gun around constantly, he says we would have lost the moral offensive. If he had taken that kind of stance on where he was constantly walking around viewing his fellow human beings, the people he was trying to persuade with nonviolence, by viewing them as potential targets, people he might have to kill, he felt it would diminish his cause, diminish him morally and spiritually. The next set of remarks that Dr. King made, and the only time that I'm aware where he commented directly on American gun laws was after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And most of us are familiar with the basic details of that. Lee Harvey Oswald essentially mail-ordered a rifle through a catalog. He found a gun he liked in a catalog, ordered it through the mail, it was delivered to his home, and that was the bolt-action rifle that he killed John F. Kennedy with. King wrote about it and his feelings on it. He talked to the climate of violence in our country, but he also spoke specifically to our gun laws, and this is what he said. He said, while the question who killed President Kennedy is important, the question what killed him is most important. Our late president was assassinated by a morally inclement climate. It is a climate filled with heavy torrents of false accusation, jostling winds of hatred, and raging storms of violence. It is a climate where men cannot disagree without being disagreeable, and where they express dissent through violence and murder. It is the same climate that murdered Medgar Evers in Mississippi and 6 innocent Negro children in Birmingham, Alabama. So in a sense, we are all participants in that horrible act that tarnished the image of our nation. By our silence, by our willingness to compromise principle, by our constant attempt to cure the cancer of racial injustice with the Vaseline of gradualism, our readiness to allow arms to be purchased at will and fired at whim, by allowing our movie and television screens to teach our children that the hero is one who masters the art of shooting and the technique of killing. By allowing all of these developments, we have created an atmosphere in which violence and hatred have become popular pastimes. And again, this is something that Dr. King was writing in late 1963. You can only imagine what Dr. King would think of the current American gun culture, where you have people buying, again, AR-15s with 30-round magazines, 100-round magazines through private sales without any background check whatsoever, 50 years later after he wrote that, right? And you have a president in Barack Obama who's probably receiving, threats on a level dramatically higher than Lyndon Baines Johnson was at the time, and probably similar to what Dr. King himself saw. So, these comments are haunting, obviously, because they remind us so much of what we're seeing today, both in political culture and in the gun culture in this country. The next touchstone I would point to with Dr. King and the way he viewed the issue was how he reacted to riots in American cities at this time. Obviously in places like Watts and other American cities, even prior to his assassination, there was significant violence by, in large part African Americans, but other minorities too, who wanted equal justice, who had legitimate grievances against government over issues like housing and employment and political equality, but who chose violence as a means to express themselves. And this was something that troubled Dr. King greatly. That to him was a very ominous sign. And he told a story once about speaking to a young man in Watts while the riots were going on, and he said, "I was out in Watts during the riots. One young man said to me, 'We won.' I said, 'What do you mean we won? 30-some people are dead, and all but 2 of them are Negroes. You've destroyed your own. What do you mean we won?' And he said, 'We made them pay attention to us.'" And King found that to be a tragically sad thing, because he obviously had just fostered a nonviolent movement that had made the entire world pay attention, in which it won incredible victories like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. And then King later wrote about Watts, 37 people dying needlessly, and he described it as 37 people dying needlessly in an uncontrolled tantrum of devastation and death. This was more human loss than has been suffered in 10 years of nonviolent direct action, which produced the revolutionary social changes in the South. And then he later said, "Violence only serves to harden the resistance of the white reactionary and relieve the white liberal of guilt, which might motivate him to action, and thereby leaves the condition unchanged and embittered. The backlash of violence is felt far beyond the borders of the community where it takes place. So, this was essentially Dr. King rejecting the use of political violence. And in many cases, was armed violence, and saying that it had no productive place in the struggle for equal rights. And furthermore, that it was counterproductive, that it was destroying communities, that it was hurting the ones that activists wanted to help the most. And then finally, and I think this example is equally telling, and it again speaks to how Dr. King was viewing increasing militancy in the civil rights movement as we moved through the 1960s after the years of the Voting Rights Act. James Meredith, the first African-American who attended the University of Mississippi and graduated from that college, he was shot by a sniper in June of 1966 during a peaceful protest. And in response, the civil rights movement planned events to draw attention to that. And at that time, there was significant disagreement in the civil rights movement as to how that should play out and what those events should look like. And Dr. King very dramatically described a meeting that he held with other civil rights activists to discuss what they should do. And he said, "I began with a plea for nonviolence. This immediately aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense." And the Deacons for Defense, for people who don't know, were a group of African-American citizens, I believe began in Alabama or Louisiana, who believed in armed defense. And frequently they would provide armed protection at civil rights protests, but they believe in confronting injustice, but at least in part with weapons, with guns. And he said, I aroused some of our friends from the Deacons for Defense who contended that self-defense was essential and that therefore nonviolence should not be a prerequisite for participation in the march. They were joined in this view by some of the activists from the Congress of Racial Equality and Students' Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I tried to make it clear that besides opposing violence on principle, I can imagine nothing more impractical and disastrous than for any of us, through misguided judgment, to precipitate a violent confrontation in Mississippi. We had neither the resources nor the techniques to win. Furthermore, I asserted, many Mississippi whites from the government on down would enjoy nothing more than for us to turn to violence in order to use this as an excuse to wipe out scores of Negroes in and out of the march. Finally, I contended that the debate over the question of self-defense was unnecessary, since few people suggested that Negroes should not defend themselves as individuals when attacked. The question was not whether one should use his gun when his home was attacked, but whether it was tactically wise to use a gun while participating in an organized demonstration. If they lowered the banner of nonviolence, I said, Mississippi injustice would not be exposed and the moral issues would be obscured. And this is really interesting commentary because, this shows Dr. King drawing a very fine line between two different levels of activity. One level of activity is, an African-American who finds their home attacked, be it in the South or the North, and who defends themselves with a firearm to protect their family. Dr. King is essentially saying, that's not something I ever question. I've always said that legitimately you could defend yourself in that situation. But Dr. King is drawing a line between that and someone who brings a gun out to a protest and is using a gun essentially to make a political message, and that political message is one of intimidation. Basically saying, if I don't get my way, I might have the opportunity to use this, or I might believe I have a right to use this weapon to vindicate my rights, and that's something that he opposed totally. Another interesting quote from that period, he talked about having conversations with other leaders in the movement, with the deacons, folks in CORE, folks in SNCC, and he said, I often talked late at night and over into the small hours of the morning with proponents of Black Power who argued passionately about the validity of violence and riots. They didn't quote Gandhi or Tolstoy. Their Bible was Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. This Black psychiatrist from Martinique argued that violence is a psychologically healthy and tactically sound method for the oppressed. And this was something, obviously, that Dr. King rejected totally. And then just, again, viewing more broadly the militancy of the civil rights movement in that area, he said, the plain inexorable fact was that any attempt of the American Negro to overthrow his oppressor with violence would not work. We didn't need President Lyndon Baines Johnson to tell us by reminding Negro rioters that they were outnumbered 10-1. The courageous efforts of our own insurrectionist brothers, such as Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, should be eternal reminders to us that violent rebellion is doomed from the start. Anyone leading a violent rebellion must be willing to make an honest assessment regarding the possible casualties to a minority population confronting a well-armed, wealthy majority with a fanatical right wing that would delight in exterminating thousands of black men, women, and children. I don't know how you get more clear than that. Essentially what he's saying is, as Lenin said, you say you want a revolution, well, you better be ready for the retribution. And he's making references there to people like, Nat Turner, who led a slave rebellion which resulted in reprisals that were horrific and that were far worse than the original violence inflicted by those who supposedly with a just cause. So, Dr. King is essentially saying here, the path of insurrection, the path of violent armed rebellion is both morally unjust and doomed from the start. And I'll just wrap up finally with one quote, which I think guides everything this man felt about the issue of armed violence and guns. Is he said later in his life, occasionally in one life develops a conviction so precious and meaningful that he will stand on it till the end. This is what I have found in nonviolence. And in the pattern of Dr. King's life, you see a man who, over time, grew more and more committed to the principle of nonviolence. And what's remarkable about that, in my mind, is we typically think in terms of the way someone ages as they become more conservative over time, more jaded, more bitter. This is a man who became more idealistic over time, and the more they threatened to kill him and his family, the more peaceful he became, the more dedicated to nonviolence he became. And I would just finally make reference, probably many of you have heard of this wonderful story that happened recently at the elementary school in DeKalb County, where this wonderful school bookkeeper, Antoinette Tuff, talked down a mentally ill young man with an AK-47 and 500 rounds of ammunition who was preparing to shoot up the school, basically by telling him she loved him and forgiving him and telling him, we're not going to hate you, stand down, lay down, I'm working this out for you, they're going to come in, they won't hurt you, I love you, I'm proud of what you're doing. And I listened to those 911 calls the other day, and I said, I'm not a very religious guy, but I said there's got to be something to this, with this happening just before the 50-year anniversary of the March on Washington, because this is such a perfect demonstration of Dr. King's philosophy. And it was such a beautiful thing. For those who haven't heard those 911 calls, do yourself a favor and listen. It was truly remarkable. She diffused the most violent situation imaginable with love and nonviolence. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Nardyne.